Hello and welcome to Australia in Space TV. My name's Chris Cubbage. I'm the editor with My Security Media and Australia in Space magazine. Today we're joined by Professor Melissa de Zwart from the University of Adelaide, in Adelaide obviously, and talking about hybrid and grey zone operations in outer space. Melissa, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Chris.
Now, this follows, you've written a chapter 14, of the hybrid threats and grey zone conflict, the challenge to liberal democracies, edited by Mitt, Regan and Aurel, Sari. Should be out by the end of the month, but your chapter specifically deals with grey zone and hybrid operations in outer space. Firstly, congratulations. I've read the chapter. Impressive body of work. And I reached out to you. We obviously cover cybersecurity and national security on our other channels as well. And this is on the back of the Australia Space Cyber Forum that I was at last week, and highlighting the dependency of human civilization on space technologies, as well as highlighting the vulnerabilities within a cybersecurity context. And then when I saw this, I was like, okay, now we're going to overlay hybrid and grey zone operations within this technology. Maybe a bit of a background to the chapter and the book. You've got a copy there with you, and then we'll just dive into some of the issues that you highlight.
Sure. So I think this is the heaviest book that I have had to carry around for a while. As you said, it'll be available shortly from OUP. And, you raised cyber, and then we talked about hybrid and grey zone in space. It's a really chilling kind of topic to consider, how dependent we are on space. And there's sort of a general, still, despite all of our work, lack of awareness on the reliance on space. But increasingly, the commercial operators in space. So now, again, there's perception that space is kind of run somewhere by someone, government, UN, who knows. And now we have sort of little challenges constantly being made to, what the legal regime in space is. And so these little challenges, whether it's suggestion that someone else is not complying with space law, or even more recently, Russia, the claim that they're going to deploy some kind of nuclear weapon in space as an anti-satellite weapon, which is completely contrary to the Outer Space Treaty. These little niggles that challenge the international domain in and of themselves become very worrying.
I think the main part, the geopolitical environment, most people will understand that, particularly China and the US. We've run some stories previously where the US has claimed that China's just not answering the phone. I think it was last year at the Space Symposium, they raised this, that they're not talking to each other specifically. And then you've started this chapter off by 2021, China raising Article 5 against the US. So I understand the geopolitics of this, but my initial thought was the implications it has on the civil space sector as we move to Space 2.0. There's a lot more civil players here, and then other nations are in this as well. Just as you went through the chapter, are you seeing potential implications on other nations and the civil space sector that they may not be aware of?
Absolutely. And of course, we had, the participation by Starlink in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And that was the first time really where there'd been, a really overt question about, well, what does this mean for the participation of a commercial operator in a war context, which became quite obvious and led to changes at SpaceX itself about how it contracted those facilities. But the more sort of nuanced ones was this one where, in 2021, China wrote a note to the UN and said, oh, by the way, UN, we're a bit concerned about the fact that Starlink is not really telling us, like, it's behaving erratically. We don't really know where it's going. We can't predict where it's going. So we have to move our space station out of the way to avoid any potential for collision. Okay, we know that there's a lot of collision, avoidance maneuvers in space. But what was interesting about this was, and China was saying, and we're reminding you, UN, that the US, under the Outer Space Treaty, is responsible for those activities of the commercial operator. And, it was kind of weird because it wasn't really alleging there was any specific breach by the US, but just a gentle reminder that the US is responsible for the activities of its corporations. And the US, responded and said, well, actually, we believe that, Starlink was behaving in accordance with, norms and rules of space. It was saying where it was going. And we sent you an email and you didn't respond. So it's just this niggle that's going on, like we are good operators in space. No, actually, we are good operators in space. And all of this kind of serves to destabilize the sort of international order. Apart from, as you said at the outset, this claim that, people aren't picking up the phone. Again, I think the average person in the street, including me, would assume that we have better methods of communication between the US and China and other states than an email or a telephone call.
Yeah. Well, we've interviewed Secure World Foundation and Dr. Peter Martinez specifically on what the UN has done and the frameworks there. So that was one thing I thought is, at least China is aware of it and following it. Not that they're following all of the rules with their launches and landings that aren't often reported to the wider sector and to the sort of space stakeholders. But the other one was just there's no shortage of examples and there are no explicit laws. This is something you say here. There are no explicit laws which prohibit the conduct of a destructive ASAT test. Only 4 countries have conducted such a test, and Russia has apparently last week put up a new ASAT satellite within a similar orbit to US satellites. One of the things that came out of the forum last week was the assumption that there won't be a sort of a kinetic attack against the satellite because it will create more debris and then impact on sort of the other assets of other countries there as well. Is that something we can just rely on, that there won't be sort of an anti-satellite attack, particularly at war? We've got major wars on now in Europe and the Middle East. We only need one between China and the US in the Indo-Pacific. We don't know how much of the space domain will play a part or how advanced they are. Is that something that either you're seeing that the UN is looking to address, or is it just simply a risk that we have to be aware of?
Well, it is something that is of concern to all nations. As you've said, there is a recognition now that if you, create debris by a kinetic attack, that has impacts on everybody in terms of access to space. I mean, you could say the same thing in terms of if you had a nuclear weapon in space. I mean, that's why they were banned under the initial Outer Space Treaty. There was a recognition after a number of nuclear tests that they were unpredictable in effect and that the EMP could disable everybody, not just the target of your attack. So where this becomes really complicated is the destabilizing belief that, for example, Russia has a nuclear weapon in space. In a sense, you could kind of say that it doesn't matter now whether it does or it does not have that, because there is a belief in a strategic sense that is a possibility. In the same way that when it was undertaking rendezvous and proximity operations, which were potentially not in and of themselves illegal or in breach of the space treaties, but no one knew why they were conducting them. And again, the release of satellites from larger satellites, again, not illegal, but you're creating this belief that there is some weapon there, some capability that may or may not exist, that creates tension. So when you had the Russian debris from the defunct Recur's P1, I think it was, immediately there was an alert saying we've got debris, it's Russian, has it been caused by an explosion? Is this some kind of ASAT test? quickly you get, companies like Leo Labs checking, what is it? What was that activity? But now you've got this heightened sense, heightened awareness, heightened security situation that if there's something happening in that environment, then it could be the start of some kind of weaponized activity. So one of the big fears I have is we keep talking about, there's no laws that cover this specific thing. But certainly it is absolutely against the Outer Space Treaty to have a nuclear or weapon of mass destruction in space. So when you have a state that is now believed to be exercising that right now, what does that tell us about its regard for the established rules-based order that they themselves were a primary signatory to? So that, again, that destabilising of the international order in and of itself creates a context for greater risk.
Yeah. It sounds very similar to what cyber was sort of 5 or 6 years ago with some of the major attacks, and is major sort of nation state sponsored attacks in a cyber context. Is a declaration of war, and is it a war type thing? And space sounds very similar in that context. Hence the title here, hybrid and grey zone operations. That sort of grey area of, is this a breach of some kind? What does it actually signal or mean? The other sort of key outline from this particular chapter was the Day Without Space exercises, and I think when I read that, I was like, hey, I haven't heard of that term before, and it's a really good one. What were some of the outcomes on that? Because again, you could talk about Day Without Cyber, and we've experienced it recently. Anyone with an Optus account, you lost everything. What does that day look like? And the same thing could happen on space. So are you seeing many of these exercises? What's some of the outcomes, or where could we potentially find out more? How often are these exercises occurring?
Well, they're occurring with increasing frequency. And certainly, you have a Day Without Space, which would be very similar to the Day Without Cyber from a civilian point of view. Banking, communication, navigation, all of those sorts of things. When you put that into a military context, when you think about how do we navigate, so position, navigation, timing, all of those things are crucial. So you need to encourage or to develop a situation where you kind of go back to, I suppose, pre-Gulf War technology. So, they call the Gulf War the first space war because of the reliance upon both government and commercial satellite data. We're going back to previous to that situation where it would be communications and obviously navigation. So if you think about ships at sea, how do they navigate now? How will they need to be able to navigate in the event of loss of communications?
Well, it sounded much like not just the loss of, but also in the cyber, again, coming back to the cyber context, that poisoning of data. So it may not be the complete loss, but even just moving small percentages, say in PNT, sort of a domain, suddenly things don't arrive exactly where or when they're supposed to, and how much of a disruption it can actually cause. And I imagine that kind of attack would have much more of an effect, I think, rather than just the loss of communications versus things start moving around and causing chaos everywhere as well. I think the other one is, I've always asked, do we pay enough attention in the cyber context to the reliance on space? Is in people's sort of cybersecurity planning of, we lose comms completely or things aren't, where in the supply chain that attack might actually occur. The last one was the pushback on operations around the Artemis Accord and China, Russia. What were your observations there?
Well, I think this is an area that's really going to heat up. I know that, when I start talking about the moon, people say, well, it's a long way off yet. Well, it's not that far away. I mean, we know that China has really been leading some very, very sophisticated, successful missions to the far side of the moon. It's looking not only at robotic landing, but resource extraction. And China is really becoming the leading partner in the International Lunar Research Station, which was originally a partnership just with Russia. now has been joined by a number of other nations in various capacities. Artemis, we now have 43 states who are signatories to the accords. So you're starting to again build up that, you know, two very distinct multi-state projects, which all are aiming for the same place, which will be the south pole of the moon, because that's where the water is most likely to be located. And what are the rules that are going to apply to those projects once they are there? And certainly Artemis, but most likely the China-led project as well, will involve a lot of commercial operators.
Yeah.
So I like to sort of say, well, you know, they are not run by militaries, but if you have a commercial operator, the same rules will apply in terms of wanting to protect what their assets are and to make sure that, you know, safety zones are enforced and those sorts of things. So again, just the development of those two competing projects, which provide capacity for them to potentially work together and, you know, fulfill that potential of space bringing humanity together. They also have the potential to develop two very diverse competitive regimes.
And I think you've highlighted there not just the impact it has on us on Earth, but then obviously the Moon and the Mars missions as well. It has longer term implications in terms of what is actually happening. So look, thank you so much for that, Melissa. I wanted to at least sort of dive in a little bit, get some awareness about this book. As you say, it's a big brick there, which is concerning in its own right, given the subject matter. But as the hybrid threats and grey zone conflict, the challenge to liberal democracies, I'll read some of this, offers the first comprehensive assessment of legal and ethical challenges posed by hybrid threats and grey zone conflict, and considers the role of law in settling non-violent disputes and how this is often used in the service of states' strategic interests. And brings together a range of, I don't have all the authors here, but a range of scholar and practitioner perspectives and geopolitical competition below the threshold of war. So we are very much in interesting times, as we often say. But Professor Melissa de Zwart, we'll have the links in the show notes, obviously, as well. And this will be available at the end of the month in July. But Professor Melissa de Zwart, from the University of Adelaide, hybrid and grey zone operations in outer space. Thank you very much for joining us on Australia in Space TV.
Thank you.